this video, we're going to take a look at resolve in UI router and how it works as part of UI router enabled Angular application. If you're already familiar to resolve in ng-route, the concept is quite similar. Before even jumping and trying to understand resolve in UI router, let us have a quick look at various ways on how we can switch to different states and also on how we can load data into those states while switching to those states. There are typically two ways on how we can really switch from one state to another as part of UI router. The first one is using routing URL. So which means the user can specify the routing URL directly as part of the browser location bar, or he can switch to another route simply by using an anchor tag with href or UISref, which were usually made up of the markup. So we can typically use any kind of routing URL to be actually used to switch to a new state. The second one is using $state service. So as part of your code, so which means you might be working with controller or scope related code in which you would like to really switch to a new state as part of your Angular application. If such is the case, $state service really comes into the picture where we can use the method go in order to switch from one state to another. You can also provide parameters or data while you would like to switch to a new state. What are the various ways on loading the data whenever you would like to switch from one state to another? The first one is we switch to the new state and then load the data. The second one is we load the data first and then switch to the new state. So which means in the first case here we are actually switching to the new state without even loading the data of that state. So we switch to the state, which means the user will be literally seeing the UI of the new state, and then we try to load the data using Ajax while it actually shows the progress message. And once the Ajax completes its own operation, we fetch the data and get it bounded, and then finally the UI of the same state where we have been in will be refreshed to show the latest results. Coming to before switching, so which means the user will not be seeing the new state related UI at all, which means he is not even into the new state. However, we try to load the data first, and after completing the loading process, then we carry that whole data into the new state, which actually refreshes the UI along with the data at once. So those two are the usual ways on how we can really work with data while switching to new states. And the later, which is nothing but loading the data upfront before even switching to the new state, is usually called resolving. So which means we try to load the data before even switching to the new state. So if you are following the second approach of loading the data while you are switching to data, it is nothing but you are working indirectly with the concept of resolving. Okay, let us see how the workflow really happens as part of our execution. So which means how the UI writer actually raises various events while we are trying to switch from one state to another, and at the same time how the resolve really works if that is integrated as part of our application. So every state configuration whenever you do as part of UI router will have an option called resolve, and if you include that resolve option, then the workflow or the life cycle of that particular switching of the new route will be taking a different direction. So let us see how it works. In the first case, we would like to see using the routing URL workflow. So which means how the execution workflow really works as part of the UI router mechanism whenever you are using routing URL. Imagine you have an Angular application and you are redirecting to a new state or new route from an existing route basically. So the first thing is that it is going to raise the event $location change stat. So this is the first event which gets fired. And again, whenever you use routing URL, that is pretty important. So this is the first event which gets fired, and immediately the second event is $state change stat. So we covered $state change stat and location change stat in our previous videos. So if you are already handling those events, you are going to see that those are getting executed the moment you have switched to a new state using your routing URL. Once these events are fired, then the browser actually changes the URL, and once the URL gets changed, again 3 more events will be fired in a successive manner. That is, the location changed success and previous state.onExit. So which means if your particular state switching is actually containing the previous state and the current state, so which means this is your old state and the current state is a new state. So UI router fires the old state related onExit method if it exists, and if it doesn't exist, then it will be simply not raised. So again, if the new state has got this method onEnter, that is going to be fired. If that is not available, it just simply won't fire it. So every state can have 2 options along with those particular events. Those are onExit and onEnter, and these 2 can be specified as part of your state configuration, and only if it is necessary or your application demands for it. Okay, once all of these events are fired, then it actually jumps or switches to the new route or new state, loads the state, and then it executes, or say it fires a state change success event. And once that is done, then it actually executes your controller or related associated scope. So all the scope related configurations and scope executions, all of the fetching of data, everything will be happening right here. And immediately after the controller, you can see if you are already having any kind of handlers at the scope level, those are going to be executed. And after that, we are going to be working with AJAX operations. So typically, this is where you are likely to have the loading of your particular data. And as you can see, you have already switched to the new route, changed the URL. You are onto the new route or new state already. The new state has been loaded. The UI should have been already rendered by this time, and then you are trying to do some kind of AJAX operations. So the UI is already ready, and then you are performing some kind of AJAX operations, which means they actually talk to some web service, fetch the data, and once the data has been fetched, we are going to use that data to actually bind to our scope and finally get the UI re-rendered. So during this particular workflow, we are switching to the new state and then we are loading the data. So let us go to another scenario using resolve. So there is no resolve option here. Now the same URL workflow here, but with the option resolve. So here we don't have resolve, but in this case we are going to introduce resolve as part of state configuration. So if such is the case, again I have an Angular application and we are trying to redirect to a new route or new state. And now you can see it is pretty similar to what we have in place, that is location change start is going to be firing, and similarly you can see this state change start is going to be fired, the change URL happens, and location change success is happening. Until here it is very similar and almost identical, but after that you can see it has jumped to a new branch. So it is not actually loading the state here. It is actually trying to execute the resolve option if it is already available. So if your state configuration is having the resolve option, that resolve is going to be executed before even loading the state. So as part of that resolve, typically the users or the application developers will be actually trying to load the data. And now you can see this particular AJAX operation will be trying to load data from the web service even before loading the state. So we have not loaded the state yet. We just changed the URL, but we did not load the state yet. So once the data is available from the web service and the data is brought to our Angular application, then actually it tries to execute onExit of the previous state from where we would like to switch, and that too if it exists. And after that, immediately it is going to execute onEnter of the current state. So that is important. So the current state is nothing but the new state to which we would like to switch to. So this state related, that is the new route or new state related onEnter, if it exists, that gets executed. And there is one arrow here, the yellow arrow, which says resolved results. So this is pretty important. As part of the resolution, we are actually trying to do some kind of AJAX operations which actually work with a web service. And this AJAX operation or this resolution will not proceed ahead until and unless this data is completely returned back to our Angular application. So our Angular application simply waits there till it actually gets the entire data from the web service all the way back to our Angular application. If the web service is hanging there, so which means if it is not returning any data, our Angular application is not going to show any information here. So that is very important. And now once we are there, so which means the data is already there as part of Ajax operation. As mentioned, it fires on exit and fires on enter. And the data, whatever it has received through the web service, is called resolved result in general. So all the data, whatever we fetch from the web service during this resolution, is usually called resolved results. And those resolved results can be automatically injected as part of your onEnter method or onEnter option you might be specifying. So if you would like to take use of those results after resolution as part of your onEnter, you can still make use of them. And once that is done, then it actually loads our state. So this is the step which actually occurs here. So you can see all the Ajax operations and resolutions are carried out first before even jumping and loading our new state. That is the only difference between this versus this, and that too during the resolution. And once the switch to the new state has been happened, immediately it follows with the rest of the events like state change success. So this needs to be renamed. This is not route change, this is state change success. And after that, you can see it actually executes the controller. So which is pretty similar to what we have in place. So this is the execute controller here. And again, there exists an yellow arrow here. So our controller can also receive all the resolution related results, whatever we had earlier, directly injected as part of our controller function. So if we would like to take advantage of those resolution related results, then we can inject those results directly into our controller to get the data into the controller before even binding happens. And once we have that results or those results into the controller, we can attach to the respective scope, or on top of it we can have our own event handlers to be executed at the scope level, which is very similar to what we have in here. And then finally all the resolved results along with the new scope data will be bound to our view using the scope. And this is the only difference. Here we bind directly to the Ajax results, and here we bind to the resolved results, which in turn are nothing but the results of our Ajax operations. So except this part and the injection of our results, the rest of the workflow is pretty similar. And again, this is whenever we are using routing URL way of switching the states. But there is another way, that is we can also switch the routes using State.go. As mentioned, we can use $state service in order to switch from one state to another as part of your router, and the workflow will be slightly different if you are using $state service versus routing URL. The difference here is that you can see the first one is always we are trying to redirect to the new service, new state. But now you can see it actually fires state change start first. It is not firing location change because the changing of URL has not happened yet, or not even at the beginning. So we are trying to switch the state first and not even the URL yet. So that is the reason it actually fires state change start first if you are working with State.go and not using routing URL. And you can see again, if the previous route or from the route wherever you would like to switch to has already defined onExit, that gets fired, and the new router related onEnter if defined will be fired, and then it actually switches to the new route. Again, even though it is switching to the new route, the URL has not been changed yet. Now it actually tries to change the URL. So before even trying to change the URL, you can see the state needs to be successfully loaded, and after that it fires state change success event, and then it actually fires location change start. So you can see in this case this is quite different. So we cannot expect these events to be always running in the same fashion, because routing URL related way of firing the events is a bit different from the life cycle of how the State.go works when compared with the routing URL. And once the change URL has successfully completed, it will be going through the change success. Then that is location change access, then from then onwards it still follows the same way of going through the execution of controller and related scope, related event handlers, do AJAX operations and get the results from the web service, and finally get the data through AJAX, get it bound to our view and to the scope directly. So this is a different way on how the events are going to be executed whenever using $go. So that is $state.go. So let us see how this one works whenever you are using resolve along with $state.go. So you can see this is $state.go with resolve, and here we do not have resolve. So this is just routing URL with resolve. So this will be pretty similar to what we have in place here. So it will be a combination of these two. So let us see. So we are trying to redirect to the new route, and as mentioned, you can see it is going to start the change, that is state change start, no location because we are not switching the URL yet, and at this point it will be just waiting, which means it will be trying to execute the resolve option if it is available. If the resolve option is available, then it goes through the AJAX operations, gets in touch with our web service, waits there till it completes fetching data from the web service. Once it has successfully retrieved all the data related to those operations and completed the AJAX request successfully, then it actually tries to execute onExit of the previous state from which we are trying to switch to, and the current state related onEnter, that is the new state to which you would like to switch to. That related onEnter, if it is available, that is going to be fired, and while firing, just very similar to the previous one, all the results of those AJAX operations, which are usually called as resolved results, can be actually injected into onEnter and taken advantage of those, and finally it jumps to the new state. That is, we are still trying to load the new state. Until here you can see the URL has not been changed yet, and that's the reason there is no location related events firing. And once the state has been successfully loaded, then the success of the state change will be firing. So this is supposed to be state change success, and after that you can see location change start is going to be fired because the browser URL is going to be changed, and once it is changed, it actually fires location change success, and from then onwards it still goes in the same fashion as explained earlier. So the controller and onEnter, those two are the components which are going to receive the resolved results, which are nothing but the data which come after all the AJAX operations have been successfully completed, and those results need to be re-injected into the respective controller or onEnter methods whenever you would like to take advantage of. And all those resolved results, once injected, will be available through scope and can be bounded to our views in whatever the way we want it. So these are all the ways on how we can switch to various routes using UI router, and at the same time take advantage of resolutions as part of switchings, either using $state service or using the routing URL workflows. Let us wrap this one up. If you are not using resolution, so which means you would like to jump or switch to the new state first and then get the data later. If you are using resolving, you would get the data first, fetch the data first, and then you are going to switch to the new route by passing this data. So that is the only difference between working with no resolution versus resolution. Okay, I have a simple example here which currently has no resolution, so that is no resolve has been specified, and it is just a typical add operation, which is actually the same thing whatever I explained in my previous video. So if you check the UI of this one, I go to calculator. The moment I click on the calculator, you can see I have a new route or new state which has been loaded with the name calc. So you can see this is the state. So if you switch back to our application, you can see calc is the state which is actually trying to fetch calculate.html, and if you open that, you are going to see two text boxes and a button, and that's exactly what we are seeing here. And the moment I provide 10 and 20, so let us clear everything here, and let us make sure I do not have anything as part of the network also here. And the moment I click on add, now you can see it has already switched to the new state, waiting for the data, and once the data has been fetched, it actually re-renders or refreshes the current state with latest bind values. So all the data whatever we have fetched using the Ajax are going to be bound through the scope, and all the UI elements bound to the scope get re-rendered as part of our particular AngularJS lifecycle. So this is a typical process. So let us go back here and again try to accomplish the same thing. So now I provide 20 and 30. So just observe the URL here and the state as well. So the moment I click on add, the URL gets changed and the UI state is also loaded. And after waiting for a couple of seconds, then the data gets loaded and finally assigned, or the UI gets refreshed. So this is how a typical state without any resolution works. So that is, we switch to the state first and then get the data later. Okay, let us modify this. So that is, I would like to have a new button called multiply to be made available, and the moment I click on that multiply, I would like to make use of the resolution. That is, I would like to use the resolve method and fetch the data first for the respective multiply operation, and after getting the results of the multiply, then only I would like to switch to the new state called something like multiply. So let us work with the new stuff. That is, I would like to add a new state for multiply alone. So for that purpose, I am going to say something like a new state needs to be added, and for this new state, I would like to name this one as something like multiply, and on top of that I need to provide all the options. And for the options, the first one is obviously the URL, the routing URL. So in this case, I would like to follow very similar to what I have in here. So that is, instead of add, I just would like to go with multiply. So on top of it, I would like to use the same result. So that is result.html, which will essentially have go back. So that is, so let me show you. So these buttons like the back and even this one, and along with this label which actually shows the result. So I would like to reuse the same result template for the multiply operation as well. So that is the reason I'm just specifying result.html as part of my new state configuration also. And on top of that, I would like to have a new controller to be maintained here, and I would like to call this controller as a multiply controller. So earlier in this case I was using add controller, but in this case I would like to have multiply controller. Okay, now comes the interesting part, that is providing the resolve. So you can provide your resolution methods by specifying resolve. So resolve is nothing but an object. So this object can have multiple properties where each of those properties will be evaluated with data before even switching to the state. So these particular members usually are nothing but functions, and those functions usually return the promises. Doesn't necessarily be always the case, but that is how a typical resolution really goes with. So in order to fetch any kind of data from the Ajax, we typically use promises, and any kind of resolution related member typically will be a promised method which actually returns a promise for returning all those particular Ajax related data. And all the promises need to be evaluated successfully as part of the resolve before even jumping or switching to the new state. That is pretty important. And if you do not have promises and just you would like to initialize with some data, just provide the data directly here without even providing the promises. But in our case, I would like to have some kind of Ajax operation to be performed right before I jump to the new state, that is before even switching to the new state. And I would like to have that whole data of the Ajax to be placed in one single variable or property called result in this case. So for that purpose, I would like to use a member called result. You can provide any member. This could be A or B also. So I just would like to go with result. So this will be a function in my case, and I would like to use data service which actually communicates with my Ajax service. So earlier I was having add operation, and now I would like to use multiply operation which actually takes A and B and goes to multiply related URL of the web service staying at this particular location 8000. So I'm going to use this data service, and in order to use this data service I need to inject it. So data service, And of course our multiply has got a couple of parameters, so I need to send these two parameters directly to data service. For that I might need to use state params as well, so those two are essential. And once I have those two injected, the first thing is that I need to get the values of a and b, and then actually call the data service related multiply method which has been exposed. So I just would like to call this method by sending a and b, and in return anyway it actually returns the promise, so I can just return the same. So I go back here. So in this case, first of all I try to get the value of a using state params dot a, and again variable b, which is going to be state params dot b. Okay, so I have a and b values fetched from the URL, that is a and b from the state. Now I need to call the data service for that. So this will be the promise object which will be returned by my data service. So I'm going to say data service dot multiply, and as part of the multiply I just need to send the values of a and b, and finally just return the promise object. And of course instead of writing two statements, I can just write only one statement by writing return data service dot multiply. So that will make our life much easier. So I can just say return data service dot multiply. So this multiply in turn actually returns the HTTP related object, which is nothing but promise in this case, and all the promises will be evaluated successfully and completed before even switching to the new state. So that is important as part of our resolution process. Okay, so this is how the resolution has been configured for my new state. So as mentioned, if the resolve is there, it gets executed first. Okay, now I need to actually add a new controller pretty much similar to what we have in here. So I just would like to copy this, and of course the first thing is that I need to modify this one to multiply, and I need to use scope, state, and I don't need state parameters or data service because I'm already using those two state parameters and data service as part of my resolution process. So I don't need any of these two, so I just delete all of this stuff. Of course I need to use go back as because I have two buttons as part of my calculate HTML. So not this one, the result.html. So I have this go back. So this go back needs to be still working, so I have that one here. So that should be good enough. So let me remove everything else. Okay, but the result needs the data to be made available in the form of result. So that is the object which is supposed to be having some information through scope or one way or another. But you can see our resolution is happening here, and once this AJAX is completed, the result of the AJAX, that is the data fetched after the AJAX call, will be always stored as part of this result. So I need to inject this result into the controller. So I go back here into my multiply controller and then inject it. So this is the most important thing. So if you don't use this, you will not be able to fetch the data which has been returned as part of this resolution. So if you have multiple members here, try to get all the members whatever you have in place and get them injected. So in this case I am using result. The same thing, the data whatever we fetch through this AJAX operation will be stored inside this, and I inject this right inside the controller, and using the same thing I can just assign directly to the scope. So which means whatever the data I receive from the AJAX results is going to be directly assigned to our scope.result, and in that way we are going to fetch the result and finally have that result to be stored and retrieved as part of our result.html. Okay, so that looks like the multiply controller is already done, but one thing, that is I need to add a new button for the multiply. So just like do add in my calculate.html, I need to add multiply. And of course once I click on multiply, it has to execute do multiply. So I don't have code for do multiply, I need to write it as part of my calculate controller. And you can see in the calculate controller I already wrote something related to do add, and very similar to do add I am going to write something like do multiply. And as part of the do multiply, all I had to do is just go to new route called multiply, and get the values out of A and B, which are nothing but whatever we are providing as part of our text boxes. So you can see those text boxes are currently being bound to A and B, and those two are the values which we are fetching and sending them across to the new state called multiply. And that new state has been already configured with the same name here called multiply, which actually takes those two variables, and those two state parameters will be turned into our AJAX request and finally get the values in the form of result, and the result gets injected into our multiply controller to the scope, and finally the scope is actually being used right inside our result.html. So if everything works fine, we should be able to get the result out of our output. So let us go to the network and make sure that we clear the browser cache. Go to home, refresh this, and let me clear everything here. Okay, we have a mistake somewhere, so let us make sure that we don't have any problems. So I injected result, but I did not use the result here. So I need to use result here. So that is the mistake. So let us go back here and go to the network. Let me clear this entire browser cache a bit. Go to home and refresh this, and everything works fine. So let me clear everything and clear everything here. So I go to calculator now, and now you can see it has already fired state change stat, and it has successfully completed state change success also. Let me clear this one, and now I would like to provide 10 and 20. So let us see the difference. First of all, I would like to go for add operation, and we have already seen this add operation. So I click on this. First of all, you can see the switching has been already done. Start and success are completed. But after the completion, we are actually loading the data, and then afterwards it is actually doing the process and gets bound. So this we have already seen. So let me clear everything and let us try to accomplish the same using multiply. So I go provide 10 and 20 and observe here how it is going to work. I click on multiply. You can see the URL is not changed, the UI is not changed, and it's still hanging there. After a couple of seconds, after getting the data, then the URL changed, UI changed, and then it has actually fired state change success. So that is important. So in this case, there is no loading message available in the UI because we have not switched to that state yet. It is still loading. So let us go back. Let us try once again and observe it. So if you see carefully, we will be still waiting on this UI or on this state without even switching to the new state when you click on multiply. Multiply, see, we are still on the same one, but once the data is done, then we switch to the new state along with the data refreshed automatically. So at once we see the results. So that is the difference between our add versus multiply. So if you see add, the first thing is that it actually jumps to the new state first, waits for the result, and then we get the result. Okay, so this looks better because the UI can show some kind of progress, but in the case of multiply, the user will not know on how actually this multiply is working. He will be just standing there for a few seconds, doesn't even know what it is doing, and finally after a surprise it might actually come out with a result or an error. So in order to show some kind of progress message, we have to show it in the previous state. So it is not how we can show as part of add. For the add, we are jumping to the new state and showing the progress message. But for multiply, we have to show some kind of progress message here, and we need to delete that or probably remove that once that particular state is done and once we are switching to the new state. So let us quickly check on how we can add progress to be shown whenever we are clicking on multiply. So let us jump back here. So I already have these two event handlers, state change stat and state change success. So I would like to make use of these two events in order to work with the progress message. So for that, I would like to check if toState. The toState is nothing but the variable which contains the new state to which we would like to switch to. So that particular object contains all the information related to the new state to which you would like to switch to, and if that particular one contains resolve member, so that is easy. So the state.resolve gives us the definition of the resolve, and if that particular resolve definition is already available, then I am going to simply say something like root scope dot is loading equals true. So make sure that we are actually specifying is loading at the root scope level. So which means this member will be made available through all the scopes as part of our application, as because typically almost all the scopes inherit from root scope. So which means if the root scope has got a new member, it is immediately made available through all the scopes as part of your application. So right now this is the simplest approach. Of course we can make it much more efficient, but I would like to make use of root scope in this case. So similarly I would like to use success, and in the success I would like to check with the same toState.resolve, and I would like to say false. So which means if it is successful, which means we are already into the new state, then I'm saying is loading equal to false, so which means there is nothing else to load. However, in the previous case, as it is trying to start, which means it is trying to load, I'm going to say is loading equals to true. And now the rest is simple. All you have to do is make use of this is loading as part of your calc.html, which shows the input boxes or the text boxes. As mentioned, we can only show the progress message as part of this one, but not really inside the other one, as because the new state is not going to be loaded until and unless the data is fetched. So in this case, I just would like to have a new div to be created, and this is going to show if and only if this member is actually could be evaluated to true. And if is loading is true, then I would like to show some kind of message, and in this case I would like to have the message to be something like color equal to red, and probably I can say loading, please wait. Okay, so that is pretty much the modification I can do. So let me clear the browser cache and let's go home and refresh this. And now I click on calculator. So let me clear everything and click on multiply once I provide the values. So I provide the values and click on multiply. And now you can see it is actually showing loading, please wait. And still you can see, observe, once it has fetched successfully, it is actually firing this event success, and it has switched from the previous state to the new state. So in that way we can show some progress even whenever you are using a resolution methodology. However, we'll have to make sure that those particular progress messages need to be shown in the previous states but not in the current state, as because the current state will not even be loading at that moment. But for the case of add method, we are not using resolution, so it actually switches immediately to the new state, and that is where we can take advantage of showing the progress as part of the new state itself. So that is how the resolve really works as part of UI router.